Welcome to the GMATstudy podcast. You're here because you believe there's a better way to study for the GMAT, and so do I. I created the GMATstudy to maximize your results and minimize your efforts so you can get to the fun parts about business school and life as quickly as possible. My name is Isaac Puglia, and I've been teaching GMAT classes and tutoring privately for the GMAT for over 6 years, and I personally have achieved a 99th percentile score on an official GMAT exam and helped hundreds of students get into the business schools of their choice. I'm excited to be a part of your MBA journey since I think the world can benefit from the best possible business leaders that we can find. And if this show is bringing you value, please share it with your friends and family who are studying for the GMAT so that together we can make this process as easy and painless for as many people as we possibly can. Let's go. Today, I want to talk about how to organize your study time, both from a small picture perspective on an individual study session basis and from a larger perspective of I'm starting now and I'm going to take the GMAT in 3 months or I'm going to take the GMAT in 6 months. So let's dive right in and let's talk about individual study sessions. These are going to vary slightly depending on which phase of preparation you're in. And I like to think of test preparation as having two phases. The first is knowledge building, just getting comfortable with the core material that the exam tests. And then the second phase would be like application and repetition and mastery, learning how to get credit for all the knowledge that you built in the first phase. So let's say, irrespective of which phase you're in, what should you do at the beginning of every study session when you sit down to study? The best recommendation I can make there is always start every single study session with some type of review. And I'll give a couple recommendations for what I think is wise to do. One good move, if you have multiple study sessions a day, is to test yourself on what you learned earlier in that day. So sit down and just from memory, can you recall 1 to 4 major takeaways from your earlier study session? If you're only studying once per day or several times per week, sit down and ask yourself, what did I learn last time I studied? That's a great, simple way to build a little bit of testing into your review. I'll talk about the value of testing in a moment. Another thing that's really wise to do, and I'll talk more about this as we go through the podcast here, is you'll want to be keeping a list of problems to go back to and redo, and at the beginning of each study session is a great time to redo some of those problems. And I think you'll find you get the best results from spacing that review out over time. So let's say you've got an hour to study. It would be great to use the first 10 minutes to test yourself on what you learned in your last study session, and then do maybe 1 to 10 review problems that you've assigned yourself to go back to and redo and see if you've made progress on those problems. So first off, a little bit of theory. Why test yourself at the beginning of your study session? Well, you want to avoid something in learning science that's called the illusion of competence. And basically, what the illusion of competence is when we're looking at something we've learned, it's very easy for us to fool ourselves into thinking that we know it. I'll give you an example. Let's say you make a study sheet and on it you put some geometry formulas and you put the equation for how to find the area of a rectangle. And you say, okay, the area of a rectangle is a base times height. You draw a picture, and then a few days later you look back at that and you look at the paper and you think, yes, I remember writing that. Yes, I remember that the formula is base times height. What you're doing there is you're just seeing what you've learned, and that makes you feel like you know it really well. But that's a little different than testing yourself on it. Testing yourself would be something like making a flashcard, putting a rectangle on the front, and putting area equals question mark. And then you have to produce something. You have to come up with something on the spot with a cue. That's really how you want to organize your review, and that's how you want to measure your knowledge and build knowledge over the time. Because interestingly enough, it's been shown in many learning science studies that you might feel like you're learning less when you use the testing method, but you actually are integrating the knowledge more deeply when you use those testing strategies versus when you get into the illusion of competence territory and you're just looking at your notes at what you've learned and thinking like, yes, I remember that. You'll feel better about the knowledge you're building. You'll feel like you know more, but you actually won't perform better on the test versus people who do the testing phase. I should say that. You'll perform a little bit better on the test, but basically the people who test themselves on this stuff are going to outperform people who just look at a review sheet by a factor of about 8, which is pretty significant if you think about it. So please integrate that type of testing into your study sessions every time you sit down to study, whether you're at the beginning of your prep, the middle of your prep, or all the way at the end. Let's say that you sit down to study, you do your review, and you're in the first phase of knowledge building. What should you do for the remainder of the study session? Well, that's the time when you want to be working through whatever materials you are using to build your content knowledge. So if you have books, you're working through those books, doing the drills at the end of the chapters in those books, maybe integrating some online resources into that if the books include that. If you're taking a digital class, you're working through the lessons in that digital class and doing practice problems. If you are taking a class, you're working through the syllabus for that class. And if you're working with a private tutor, you're working on whatever you've been assigned for that period of time. So in the knowledge building phase, I think your study is generally pretty linear. So you're working on, okay, today I'm working on fractions, and then the next day I'm reviewing fractions, and then I'm working on percents. And then the next day I'm reviewing fractions and percents, and I'm working on probability. And then the next day I'm reviewing all that stuff, and then I'm building on top of that counting questions or overlapping sets questions or whatever the case may be, geometry questions. So that phase is about exposure. And if you want a good tip, you probably want to aim for somewhere between 50% and 100% comprehension in that knowledge building phase. I think some people stress themselves out too much trying to know everything perfectly before they get to the practice test phase. And it's not the end of the world. If you do know everything perfectly, that's great. But I think you sometimes get in trouble if you're stressing yourself out too much by doing that. So if you're getting 70% understanding of what you're learning and 70% comprehension of what you're learning, that's pretty darn good. Because you're going to see all that stuff again when you get to the practice test phase or the application phase. And at that point, you'll be able to dive deeper into whatever the focus areas are that you need to work on. So that's going to be, for most of us, at least probably 3 to 12 weeks, I would say, like maybe 1 to 3 months, just going through the basic material, depending on where you're starting, and trying to integrate that. For some people, it might be less if you're really advanced. For some people, it might be a lot more. For example, if English is not your first language and you're trying to learn all the grammar content for sentence correction, that can take a significant amount of time to make that natural. And again, you don't need perfection in that first phase of your preparation, but you do want to be better. You want to be better. You want to be at least 50 to 70% better, ideally more than that, but sometimes things don't work out ideally in adult life when you have a job and you have a family and you have friends and you have all types of commitments. 50 to 70% is pretty good for that first phase. Some people might disagree with me, and that's fine. That's my recommendation. So let's say you've gone through the knowledge building phase. Now what do you do? Well, now your study sessions are going to change a little bit in terms of how they're organized. So you've gone through all the basic material. Now's the time to start taking practice exams, measuring your progress, and then building study plans in between those practice exams to continue to hit your goal. So a couple pieces of advice here. First is, on your first few practice tests, they're probably not going to go super great. I hate to say it, but it just tends to be the case. A lot of us, after going through the knowledge building phase, are expecting some type of big leap on the second practice test. And you know what's interesting about the GMAT is a lot of people's practice tests on the second or third one, they often go down. They're often worse than the first practice test. Sometimes they're the same. Sometimes they're just not a great improvement, and that can be very disheartening. So why are people's scores going down if they know more about the GMAT? A lot of that comes down to time management, which I'll get much deeper into in the future. But the short version of that is, if you know more material, you're tempted to spend longer on questions that you might not have given as much energy on your first practice test because you're not taking it as seriously a lot of times on the first practice test. You're like, oh, it's a diagnostic, it's no big deal. Whereas when you've studied a little bit, you're like, okay, now it's game time. I gotta get in here and make something happen. I gotta move this score. I gotta prove to myself that the last 3 weeks or last 3 months have been worth it in terms of the time I've invested. And so you often overinvest in questions, and then that causes time trouble, and then it becomes difficult to get credit for all the new knowledge that you've built. So my best tip I can give you for the practice test phase is just don't stress too much about those first few practice tests. When it comes time to take a practice test, you want to try to make it as realistic as possible, have a similar environment to the testing center, sitting at a desk with a computer in front of you. You want to have the types of snacks you're likely to have, and you want to use regulation break times. And you can find online what that looks like. That way you get the most realistic data point and the most realistic practice in terms of stamina and what you're going to have to confront during the exam. And again, those first few exams can be kind of jarring in that respect. So don't worry if they're tough. Just allow yourself to suck at the GMAT for a little while. Allow yourself not to be amazing for the first part of the practice test phase. So then let's say you take the test, score is what it is, you feel good, you feel bad, whatever. You take the rest of the day off and you come back the next day and it's time to study. Well, as always, you're going to start with some review. You're going to think, okay, what are the most important things that I've learned in the last week or so? And let me hit 1 to 10 review questions that I think would be worth revisiting. Then you're going to dive into the exam and you're going to review it with a particular attention to timing, a particular attention to missing questions that you probably should have gotten right, i.e. you knew how to do the question, but you missed it anyway. And then you're going to go through every other question, and you're going to take the toughest ones and add them to your review list. So I've mentioned this a couple times. I've mentioned it in previous podcasts. I'll go into just a simple version of the review list. What you want to do is, particularly on the quant side, you want to be tracking questions that have interesting strategies or strategies that you know you want to master, and you want to be logging those in a place where you can come back and revisit them on a regular basis. It's a good idea to write the problem source so you know where to find it, and then it's a good idea to track how long it takes you and whether or not you got it right or wrong every time you did it, and then what you want to remember the next time you see that problem. And then you want to measure, are you remembering what you're supposed to be doing on that problem and that type of problem? And what you're doing there is you're testing yourself. You're almost making like a flashcard out of the problem itself, where the front of the flashcard is the problem text, and then the back of the flashcard mentally is, what is the strategy or the thought that I want to associate with this type of problem? Is this a type of problem that I should guess randomly on in less than 30 seconds? Is this a type of problem that I should plug numbers into the answer choices? Is this a type of problem where I should use prime factors? That type of stuff, that type of repetition of seeing problems and then associating them with a particular strategy will really help you with confidence on the test. It'll really help you with speed over time, and it'll help your score. It'll really help your score, because most of the GMAT is pattern recognition. Can I associate the current problem I'm looking at with a question that I've already seen in the past? So that's a great way to start building that up. And you're going to do those review questions every time you study, whether you're in the knowledge building phase or the practice test phase. Now, when you're in the practice test phase, you do that review, and then it's time to start reviewing the exam. I already talked about what you want to do there. Separate from the redo list, you're going to want to log the questions that you knew how to do but missed. And you want to treat those a little bit differently. When you're looking at those questions that you knew how to do but missed, usually you're missing them because of some type of bad habits that you have. And so you really want to put the emphasis not on re-solving those questions over and over again, like the strategy queue questions or the redo list, same thing. But instead, you want to focus on, what should I be doing on all future questions that will keep me from making this type of mistake again? Because the biggest killer, I'm sure you'll find this as you get more and more knowledge on the test and take more practice tests, one of the biggest killers of people's scores is missing questions they know how to do. And that's a huge problem, because there's a lot of time pressure. A lot of people rush through questions they know how to do. And you really want to start building your good habits for preventing that from happening right now, wherever you are in your prep. You want to start building those habits. So that's really the nuts and bolts of organizing your study time. Every time you sit down to study, you want to start by testing yourself on something you've learned recently to measure your knowledge and grow your knowledge over time. And then you want to work linearly through the knowledge building phase, and then you want to review your practice tests with an eye for timing, missing questions you know how to do, and then finally, content. So let's go one step further with that. When it comes to building content knowledge in the practice test phase, you want to have some way of logging the different types of questions you're missing and what area they're from. Ideally, you also have some notes on why you're missing those types of questions from that area as you review. So for example, let's say I'm missing a lot of geometry questions. I would log every single question in a spreadsheet from each exam, and I would categorize it. Okay, here are the geometry, here are the number properties, here are the fractions, decimals, and percents questions, whatever the categories may be. And many online test providers will provide you with that type of analysis. For example, that's one reason I recommend the Manhattan Prep exams, because you can use an assessment report that'll do all this for you, which is really nice. And then you want to take a look at the data and say, okay, I was 3 out of 4 on word problems or rates questions, but I was only 1 out of 6 for geometry questions, something like that. Those numbers are a little unrealistic. It'd probably be more like 1 out of 4 for geometry and maybe like 3 out of 12 for word problems, something like that. You usually see more word problems than geometry questions on the GMAT. So what do you do then? Well, what you want to do is take a look at how often each content area is showing up. So you look at your weaker areas in terms of accuracy and in terms of time spent, and you ask which one of these is showing up the most, and that's how you'll prioritize what you want to work on content-wise in between practice tests. And you're going to take a step back after you review the whole exam. You're going to say, how important is it to improve my timing? How important is it for me to work on the habits that are going to prevent me from missing questions I know? And how important is it for me to work on this content material? And you're going to weigh those based on what you think is having the biggest impact on your score. And then you're going to design a little study plan for yourself before the next practice test so that you can be better by the time you take the next exam. So let's say you think all those things are affecting your score equally. Well, then about a third of your time during the week should be spent on timing drills. You can just do 10 questions in the official guide straight through for 20 minutes or another reputable source. If you really feel that you're missing too many questions that you know how to do, then you want to take one of those timing drills and take some of the habits from your I knew it but missed it list and make the point of that time set implementing the habits that you want to grow with. That's really, really valuable for decreasing your questions that you knew how to do but missed on each exam. And if you think that content is the biggest factor, or if that's going to be 1/3 of your study time, then you're going to spend a third of your study time going through official guide problems or problems that you find online for those content areas and just doing more reps and more knowledge building on those specific areas. Now, the one tip I'll make before I go on is most people do too little studying in between practice tests. They don't make enough substantive changes so that they're confident that the score is going to move on the next exam. And I would really caution you against this state of mind that a lot of people get in, which is just, oh, let me just take 7 practice tests in 7 days and that'll get me really, really great at the GMAT. Honestly, I wish it was that easy. And for some very, very tiny percentage of people, it is that easy. They come in with a 730, they take a few practice tests, they get a 770 on test day, and they're done, and they're happy. And a lot of times those people post stuff online, and it's easy to think, if you're starting at a 580 or a 480 or a 380, it's easy to think, oh my God, everyone out there starting with a 730. That's generally not the case. That's a tiny, tiny percentage of people, and a lot of times they're very incentivized to post that stuff online because it looks good. You know, it gets a lot of attention, and it's really nice to be validated for our natural abilities. Let's be honest. But that is not generally the best strategy for most students, in my experience. So, what do you do? Well, you just make sure that you take enough time in between practice tests to actually know that you're better. And that way, if the score doesn't move on the next test, you know something else or something weird happened that you're going to be able to figure out when you review it, because you'll know you're actually better at the exam. You'll also be able to better measure whether you're executing on your new knowledge on new practice tests, and also it'll keep you from taking too many practice tests, stressing yourself out, and probably the worst, which is just taking practice tests and hoping that the score is going to go up. Keeping your fingers crossed like, well, you know, I studied a little bit, maybe this one will be better. That's definitely a state of mind you would like to stay out of as much as possible. Now, one caveat to that is earlier, when you're farther away from your official GMAT, you probably want a little bit more time in between practice tests to do more knowledge building. As you get closer to your exam, you'll probably want at least 2 to 4 sequential practice tests about a week apart, maybe a little bit less even if you have more time, to make sure you're building stamina for your official test day. So I think you can take exams a little in closer succession as you get closer to your official test. Now, a couple more recommendations there. First is, I would recommend using third-party practice tests in the earlier part of your practice test phase because they tend to have better analysis features, and I would save the MBA.com exams or the GMAC exams toward later in your prep when you're closer to your official test, because those use the real scoring algorithm, but they don't have great analysis features, so they're a little tougher to pinpoint your strengths and weaknesses with. Last tip I'll give there is that there is a 20-point margin of error in the actual GMAT scoring algorithm. So when you get to test day, if you got a 680, it might have been a 690 or a 670 on any other day. So luck of the draw can play a role, especially if you're at the very, very top of the score trajectory. So you'll probably want to mentally plan, when you're thinking about this overall study plan, you'll probably want to mentally plan to take the test at least twice, just to control for that element of luck. Like if you saw 5 strength area questions at the end or 5 weakness area questions at the end. Now, one final tip for test day would be to treat the actual exam just like your next practice test. And I think for some people, the pressure of the real exam, like, oh, this is different than my practice test, can be helpful. But I think for the vast majority of people, it's actually harmful. And instead, you want the real test day to feel very much like your practice so that all the good stuff you did in practice translates to the real exam. So when you go in there, ideally, it's very familiar and you can sit down and just take the test and think, yes, I'm in a different environment, but I'm very familiar with this overall process. So I recommend for most people just treating the actual exam day just like your next practice test. I think it'll make it more likely that you'll execute on the things and the good habits that you built in the practice test phase than it will if you go in there and think like, oh, now everything's different. Now the pressure's on. Now I've got to take this test some different way mentally or emotionally than I have in the past. So, as always, my greatest hope is that this material will make your studies as easy and as painless as possible. If you want more tips and strategies for optimizing your performance on the GMAT, just head to thegmatstrategy.com and check out my video presentation on how to achieve your goal score in half the normal time and with half the normal effort. In the meantime, this is a weekly show, so please subscribe and stay positive and stay consistent with your studies. Let me know if you have questions. You can reach me on Instagram at the GMATstrategy, on YouTube /the GMATstrategy, Facebook /the GMATstrategy, on Reddit at u/the GMATstrategy. And if you find other channels to reach out to me, I will do my absolute best to answer as many questions as I can possibly get to. I'll talk to you soon.